The morphine was wearing off when I heard them arguing in the hallway. Through the thin hospital walls, David's voice carried that familiar edge of entitlement, the same tone he'd used when we were kids and he wanted my toy. But this time, he wasn't fighting over a doll or a bike. He was fighting over my bedroom. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. She's going to need help for months, Carol whispered, though her version of whispering could wake the dead. It only makes sense for us to move into the master suite temporarily. The kids need more space anyway, and with Michael starting high school, temporarily? Pat's laugh was sharp enough to cut glass. Nothing's temporary with you too. Remember when you temporarily borrowed Mom's china set? I should have said something. Should have pressed the call button and told them all to get out. But something held me back, some morbid curiosity about how far they'd actually go. 3 days post-surgery, barely able to sit up without help, and they were already dividing up my house like I was dead. The irony wasn't lost on me. For 43 years, I'd been the one everyone came to when they needed money, needed a place to stay, needed someone to co-sign a loan or watch their kids or organize family holidays. I was the responsible one, the one with the stable job. And the house with enough bedrooms for everyone. The one who never married, never had kids of my own, so obviously I had nothing better to do than take care of everyone else's problems. And now, laid up with titanium rods holding my spine together, they saw opportunity. The pain started 18 months earlier, a dull ache between my shoulder blades that I blamed on my desk job at Henderson Insurance. 40 hours a week hunched over actuarial tables and claim forms had given half the office back problems, so I figured I was just joining the club. I bought a better chair, tried yoga, even splurged on those expensive ergonomic pillows that promised to cure everything, from chronic pain to bad luck. But the ache grew teeth. By winter, I was popping ibuprofen like candy and sleeping propped up against 3 pillows because lying flat felt like someone was driving nails into my vertebrae. Dr. Hayes, my family physician for the past 15 years, ordered x-rays, then an MRI, then finally sat me down in her office with that look doctors get when they have to deliver news that's going to change everything. Severe degenerative disc disease, she said, pointing to the ghostly images of my spine on her computer screen. Multiple levels, with significant nerve compression. Rachel, I'm surprised you've been functioning at all. The specialist she referred me to was Dr. Elizabeth Hayes, no relation, just one of those cosmic coincidences that felt significant at the time. Dr. Hayes the surgeon was younger than Dr. Hayes my family doctor, with steady hands and eyes that had seen enough suffering to know the difference between pain that could be managed and pain that was stealing someone's life one day at a time. We're looking at a multi-level spinal fusion, she explained during our consultation. T10 through L3. It's major surgery, Rachel. You'll be in the hospital for at least a week, then months of recovery at home. You'll need help with basic tasks. For the first few weeks, showering, cooking, even getting dressed. I nodded like I understood, but the truth was I couldn't process it. Major surgery felt like something that happened to other people, older people, people who hadn't been careful about their health their whole lives. I ate salads, took vitamins, went for walks in the evenings. I'd never even broken a bone. Do you have family nearby? Dr. Hayes asked. Someone who can stay with you during the initial recovery? Yes, I said automatically, because of course I did. David lived 20 minutes away with Carol and their 2 kids. Pat had moved back to Riverside after her divorce, renting an apartment across town but always complaining about how cramped it was. My family had never hesitated to ask me for help over the years. Surely they'd return the favor when I needed it most. I scheduled the surgery for the first week of October, giving myself time to arrange everything. I cleaned my house until it sparkled, stocked the pantry with easy-to-prepare meals, and even bought one of those grabber tools and a shower chair from the medical supply store. I felt prepared, organized, in control. The night before the surgery, David and Carol came over for dinner. I'd made lasagna, their favorite, though bending over to get it out of the oven sent lightning bolts down my legs. We sat around my dining room table, the one I'd inherited from our grandmother, the one where we'd eaten Sunday dinners as kids after Mom died, and I explained what the next few months would look like. So you'll probably need to stay here for a while, I said, trying to keep my voice casual. Just until I can manage on my own again. Dr. Hayes said 6 to 8 weeks before I can lift anything heavier than a coffee cup. Carol set down her fork, and I caught the look that passed between her and David. It was the same look they'd shared at Mom's funeral when the lawyer was reading the will, the look that said they were doing calculations in their heads. Of course, David said quickly. Whatever you need. We're family. But even as he said it, I saw Carol's eyes drift toward the living room, toward the built-in bookshelves and the original hardwood floors and the bay window that caught the morning light just right. My house was worth 3 times what they'd paid for their cramped ranch across town. My master bedroom was bigger than their entire living room. I should have seen it then, should have recognized the hunger in the way. Carol's gaze lingered on my grandmother's china cabinet, the calculation in how David asked about my recovery timeline. But I was scared and in pain and desperately wanting to believe that when everything fell apart, family would catch you. The surgery took 8 hours. 8 hours of Dr. Hayes carefully separating muscle from bone, removing damaged discs, inserting titanium rods and screws to fuse my vertebrae into a single, stable unit. 8 hours of my spine being dismantled and rebuilt while I floated in chemical unconsciousness, dreaming of walking without pain. I woke up in the ICU with a tube down. My throat and electrodes stuck to my chest like electronic leeches. The world was soft around the edges, cushioned by morphine and anesthesia, but underneath the chemical comfort was a new kind of pain. Not the familiar grinding ache I'd lived with for months, but something sharper, more immediate. Surgical pain. The price of getting better. The first few days passed in a haze of medication adjustments and physical therapy consultations. Nurses came and went like ships in the night, checking vitals, adjusting 4 drips, helping me learn to sit up without twisting my newly fused spine. Dr. Hayes visited twice a day, examining the incision site and asking about my pain levels on a scale of 1 to 10. "How are we feeling today?" she'd ask, and I'd always answer, "Fine," because what else do you say? That everything hurt? That I felt like I'd been hit by a truck? That somewhere between the morphine fog and the reality of not being able to reach my own feet, I was starting to panic about what came next? David and Carol visited every day, bringing flowers and magazines and updates about work that I pretended to care about. They sat in the uncomfortable hospital chairs and made conversation about everything except the elephant in the room, when I was coming home and how we were going to manage my recovery. It was Pat who finally brought it up on day 4, settling into the bedside chair with her usual lack of ceremony. "So what's the plan when you get out of here?" she asked, unwrapping a candy bar she'd bought from the vending machine. "David said something about them staying at your place for a while." "Just until I can manage on my own," I said, though even saying it made my chest tight with anxiety. The physical therapist had been clear about the limitations: no lifting, no bending, no twisting, no driving for at least 6 weeks, no going up and down stairs more than necessary. My bedroom was on the 2nd floor, my laundry room in the basement. Everything about my house suddenly seemed designed to sabotage my recovery. "Makes sense," Pat said, but there was something in her tone that made me look at her more carefully. Though I have to say, Carol seemed pretty excited about getting out of their place. She was asking the nurses a lot of questions about your recovery timeline. Before I could ask what she meant, David and Carol appeared in the doorway, loaded down with a gift bag and matching smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. "How's our patient today?" Carol chirped, setting the bag on my bedside table. "I brought you some of those body washes you like, the expensive ones from that boutique downtown. Figured you'd want to feel pampered when you get home." Home. The word should have been comforting, but instead it sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. I watched Carol arrange the bottles on my table, noticed how her fingers lingered on my expensive lotion, how her eyes catalogued everything in my private room like she was taking inventory. "The discharge planner wants to meet with us tomorrow," David said, settling into the chair Pat had vacated, "to go over the home care instructions and make sure we understand everything." Us. Like we were a unit, a team. Like my recovery was a family project instead of my personal nightmare. That night, after visiting hours ended and the hospital settled into its restless overnight rhythm, I lay awake staring at the ceiling tiles and trying to ignore the growing knot of anxiety in my stomach. Through the thin walls, I could hear other patients, someone crying, someone's TV turned up too loud, the constant beeping of monitors and hiss of oxygen machines. But underneath all that noise was something else, something that made my skin crawl. The sound of my family in the hallway, arguing about my bedroom. I pressed the button to raise the head of my bed and strained to listen, my heart pounding despite the beta blockers they'd given me to keep my blood pressure stable. Through the gap under my door, I could see shadows moving back and forth, and voices that tried to stay whispered but kept rising with emotion. "Only practical solution," David was saying. "She can't handle stairs for months, and the master bedroom has that big bathroom with the walk-in shower. Practical for who?" Pat's voice was sharp. "You mean practical for you and Carol too. Finally get the house you've always wanted. That's not what this is about." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Carol's attempt at righteous indignation fell flat. This is about Rachel's recovery. She needs help, and we're the ones stepping up to provide it. By taking over her bedroom? By moving your kids into her house like you own the place? We're not taking over anything. We're helping family. But I heard the lie in it, heard the hunger underneath the concern. I'd heard that same tone when David had talked our elderly neighbor Mrs. Chin into selling him her car for half its value, when Carol had convinced her sister to co-sign a loan she'd never intended to pay back. It was the voice of people who saw opportunity in other people's misfortune. The voices faded as they moved away from my door, but the damage was done. I lay there in the medicinal darkness, feeling something cold and hard settling in my chest. For 43 years, I'd been the reliable one, the one who said yes when everyone else said no, the one who opened her door and her wallet and her heart to family who needed help. And now I was the one who needed help, and they were already dividing up the spoils. The discharge planning meeting the next morning was a masterclass in manipulation disguised as family concern. Carol arrived with a notebook and a list of questions, playing the role of devoted sister-in-law so convincingly that even the social worker seemed impressed. David sat beside her, nodding thoughtfully as the nurse explained wound care and medication schedules, asking intelligent questions about physical therapy and recovery milestones. I sat in the hospital wheelchair, wearing the clothes Pat had brought from home, loose sweatpants and a button-up shirt that accommodated the back brace I'd need to wear for the next 3 months, and watched my family perform concern-like. It was a Broadway show. Now, Rachel will need assistance with daily activities for at least the first few weeks, the discharge planner explained, consulting her clipboard. Bathing, dressing, meal preparation. The stairs in your home will be challenging, so we recommend setting up a temporary bedroom on the first floor if possible. Actually, Carol jumped in smoothly, we've already thought about that. Rachel's master bedroom has the best setup for recovery, the large bathroom with the walk-in shower, plenty of space for a wheelchair if needed. We're planning to stay with her for the duration of her recovery, so it makes sense for us to take the smaller guest rooms and let Rachel have the room that's best suited for her needs. The lie was so smooth, so reasonable sounding, that for a moment I almost believed it myself. Almost forgot that the guest rooms were on the second floor too, almost overlooked the fact that if they were really concerned about my mobility, they'd be suggesting I take the guest room on the first floor, not offering to graciously allow me to keep my own bedroom. That sounds like an excellent plan, the social worker said, making notes on her forms. Having family support during recovery significantly improves outcomes. You're very fortunate to have such a dedicated support system. Fortunate. I sat there in my hospital wheelchair, my spine held together with titanium and my future entirely dependent on people who were already planning how to rearrange my furniture, and tried to remember what fortunate felt like. The ride home was surreal. David had borrowed a friend's SUV because my little sedan sat too low for me to get in and out safely. Carol had insisted on coming along, ostensibly to help me get settled, but really to begin her inspection of her temporary new home. She spent the 20-minute drive pointing out things that would need to be adjusted for my recovery, the throw rugs that might cause me to trip, the furniture that would need to be moved to accommodate my walker, the kitchen cabinets that were too high for me to reach safely. We should probably clear out some of your bedroom furniture too, she said as David pulled into my driveway. Make room for a bedside commode, maybe a hospital bed if you need one. I saw some beautiful storage solutions at Target that would be perfect for organizing your medications and supplies. Storage solutions. Like my bedroom was a problem to be solved rather than a space I'd carefully curated over the years. Like the antique dresser that had belonged to my grandmother was just an obstacle to Carol's vision of efficient medical care. My house looked smaller than I remembered, though nothing had changed in the week I'd been gone. The October maples in my front yard were dropping their leaves like golden confetti, and someone, probably my neighbor Mr. Peterson, had mowed my lawn and collected my mail. Everything was exactly as I'd left it, but something fundamental had shifted. I wasn't coming home to my sanctuary anymore. I was entering occupied territory. David helped me out of the car while Carol bustled ahead to unlock the front door, already talking about where they'd put their suitcases and which rooms the kids would take. I stood on my own front porch, gripping my walker and trying to reconcile the woman who'd left this house a week ago, independent, self-sufficient, in control of her own life, with the person I'd become. Someone who needed help getting dressed, who couldn't lift a coffee pot, who was about to surrender her bedroom to people who saw her vulnerability as their opportunity. Ready? David asked, his hand gentle on my elbow. I wasn't ready. I might never be ready. But I nodded anyway and took my first careful steps back into my old life, which was already becoming something else entirely. Inside, Carol was opening windows and making approving noises about the afternoon light in the living room. She'd already moved my reading chair away from its usual spot by the fireplace, creating what she called better traffic flow for my walker. My throw pillows were stacked neatly on the couch instead of arranged the way I liked them. Small changes, barely noticeable, but each one felt like a tiny invasion. "Why don't you rest on the couch while we bring our things in?" Carol suggested, plumping the pillows she'd just rearranged. "David can make you some tea, and I'll start organizing the bedroom situation." The bedroom situation, like my most private space, was a logistical problem requiring Carol's management expertise. I lowered myself carefully onto the couch, my back brace making it impossible to find a comfortable position. Through the front window, I could see David and Carol making multiple trips from the car, carrying suitcases and boxes and what looked like half their household belongings. This wasn't the overnight bag of someone planning to help with recovery. This was the luggage of people planning to move in. My cell phone buzzed with a text from Pat. "How are you settling in? Let me know if you need anything." I stared at the message for a long time, listening to Carol's voice drift down from upstairs as she evaluated my bedroom furniture and planned its rearrangement. Part of me wanted to text back honestly, to admit that I was scared and overwhelmed. And starting to realize that needing help had made me vulnerable in ways I'd never anticipated. Instead, I typed back, "Fine. Thanks for checking." Because what else could I say? That I was trapped in my own house with people who were already treating it like their own? That every time Carol mentioned another improvement she wanted to make, I felt a little more like a guest in my own life? That I was starting to understand the difference between family who helped because they loved you and family who helped because they saw what they could get? The afternoon sun slanted through my living room windows, warming the hardwood floors I'd refinished myself 5 years ago, highlighting the built-in bookshelves where I displayed my grandmother's china and my collection of first-edition mysteries. Everything looked the same, but everything felt different. Like I was seeing my own life from the outside, watching someone else's family take possession of someone else's house. Upstairs, I could hear Carol reorganizing my dresser drawers and discussing paint colors with David. They were settling in for a long stay, making themselves comfortable in ways that went far beyond temporary help. And I was sitting on my own couch, in my own house, feeling like an outsider in the life I'd spent 43 years building. The morphine was definitely wearing off now, and with it went any illusion that this arrangement was going to work the way I'd hoped. I closed my eyes and tried to imagine 8 weeks of this, 8 weeks of Carol managing my space and my schedule, 8 weeks of David making decisions about my care like I wasn't sitting right there, 8 weeks of feeling grateful for help that came with strings attached. 8 weeks suddenly felt like a lifetime. But I had no choice. I couldn't take care of myself, couldn't drive, couldn't even shower without help. I needed them, and they knew it. The question I was just beginning to ask myself was simple: what, exactly, was this help going to cost me? And would I still recognize my life when I was finally strong enough to reclaim it? The pattern started when we were kids, though I didn't recognize it then. David was 3 years older, which in childhood terms made him practically an adult in my eyes. When Mom got sick, really sick, he stepped into the role of family spokesman with an ease that should have been my first warning. I was 12 when the cancer took her, old enough to understand that everything was changing but too young to see the chess moves David was already making. While I sat by Mom's hospital bed reading her romance novels aloud, David was in the hallway talking to doctors about treatment options and insurance coverage. While I held her hand during chemotherapy sessions, he was meeting with the bank about refinancing the house. Rachel's too young to understand these things, he'd tell the adults who asked where I was during these important conversations. I'm handling the family business now. But I wasn't too young to notice that David's version of handling family business involved a lot of decisions that benefited David. When Mom died that February, leaving us orphans in a house that suddenly felt too big and too empty, David convinced our Aunt Linda to let him manage Mom's life insurance payout. For Rachel's education, he explained solemnly, all of 15 years old but talking like he was applying for a bank presidency. She'll need money for college, and someone has to make sure it's there when the time comes. Aunt Linda, overwhelmed with grief and the sudden responsibility of 2 traumatized kids, agreed. David opened a joint savings account with himself as the primary holder, promising to add my name when I turned 18. The money would be safe, he assured everyone. He'd make sure of it. I believed him because I wanted to. Because he was my big brother and the only family I had left, and because the alternative was admitting that I was completely alone in the world at 12 years old. So I went to school and tried to be normal while David played adult, making decisions about our lives like he was our guardian instead of another kid who'd lost his mom. The first crack in my faith came junior year of high school when I started looking at colleges. I'd kept my grades up despite everything, maintained a 3.8 GPA and scored well on the SATs. My guidance counselor was excited about my prospects, talking about scholarships and application deadlines and the bright future that was waiting for me. About that college fund, I said to David one evening as he sat at Mom's old desk, supposedly doing homework but actually playing some computer game. I need to know how much is there so I can figure out financial aid. David didn't look up from his screen. Don't worry about it. There's plenty. But I need actual numbers for the applications. Mrs. Rodriguez said. I said don't worry about it. His tone was sharp enough to cut off any further questions. I'm handling it. But when the acceptance letters started coming in and the financial aid packages were calculated, suddenly there wasn't plenty. There was, according to David's careful accounting, exactly enough to cover 2 years at the local community college if I lived at home and worked part-time. What happened to the rest of it? I demanded, standing in his doorway with my acceptance letter to Ohio State crumpled in my hand. Mom's policy was for $50,000. Even with 6 years of expenses, there should be more than this. David finally looked up from his computer, his expression patient in that condescending way that made me feel like I was still 12 years old. Rachel, you have no idea how expensive it's been to keep this house running. Insurance, taxes, maintenance, food, your clothes, your school supplies. Did you think money just appeared out of thin air? You were supposed to get a job too. I shot back. That was the plan when Aunt Linda agreed to this arrangement. I did get a job. Managing our finances is a full-time job. The argument that followed was the first time I'd ever truly fought with David, the first time I'd questioned his decisions or challenged his authority. He responded with a hurt that seemed genuine, wounded that I'd accuse him of mishandling our mother's legacy, devastated that I didn't trust his judgment after everything he'd sacrificed for our family. I've been taking care of you for 6 years, he said, his voice heavy with martyrdom. I could have left for college, could have started my own life, but I stayed here to make sure you were okay. And this is how you thank me? The guilt was immediate and overwhelming. Here I was, attacking the person who'd kept our family together, questioning the brother who'd given up his own dreams to take care of me. I apologized through tears, promising I didn't mean it, swearing I was grateful for everything he'd done. It would take me years to realize that David had never applied to any colleges, had never shown any interest in leaving Riverside or pursuing anything beyond a high school diploma. His sacrifice was fictional, but his resentment was real. I went to community college and lived at home, commuting 40 minutes each way to classes while working nights at a local restaurant to help with expenses. David got a job at the auto parts store downtown, bringing home stories about difficult customers and an unfair manager who didn't appreciate his work ethic. Our lives fell into a routine that felt normal after the chaos of losing Mom, but underneath the surface, patterns were being established that would define our relationship for decades. When I graduated with my associate degree and transferred to a 4-year university on academic scholarship, David was supportive in the way that family should be. He helped me move into my dorm, carrying boxes up 3 flights of stairs and expressing appropriate pride in my accomplishments. But there was something in his smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, something that looked almost like disappointment. Just remember where you came from, he said as he hugged me goodbye. That first day. Family is what matters in the end. College was the first time I'd ever lived independently, the first time I'd made decisions without consulting David or considering how they'd affect our household budget. I threw myself into my studies, majoring in mathematics with dreams of becoming an actuary. Numbers made sense in ways people often didn't. They followed rules, behaved predictably, delivered consistent results when you applied the right formulas. I also met people who didn't know me as David Thompson's little sister, people who saw me as Rachel first and foremost. I made friends who came from families where siblings supported each other without keeping score, where help was given freely without expectations of payback. I started to see that the dynamic between David and me wasn't normal, wasn't healthy, wasn't the way families were supposed to work. But guilt is a powerful thing, and whenever I started to question our relationship, David would call with some crisis that required my attention. The furnace needed repair, and he couldn't afford it on his salary. His car broke down, and he needed money for a new transmission. The property taxes had gone up, and he was struggling to make ends meet in Mom's house that we still jointly owned. Each crisis came with a reminder of everything he'd done for me, everything he'd sacrificed to keep our family together. And each time, I sent money or came home to help, because that's what family did. That's what David had taught me family meant. After graduation, I got a job with Henderson Insurance in Riverside, partly because it was a good opportunity and partly because it meant I could be close to David. I bought my own house 3 miles from the one we'd grown up in, a modest 2-bedroom that felt like a mansion after years of dorm rooms and shared apartments. I was 24 years old, financially independent for the first time in my life, ready to build something that was mine. That lasted exactly 6 months. David's relationship with Carol had been on and off since high school, one of those dramatic partnerships that thrived on breakups and makeups and public arguments in grocery store parking lots. When Carol got pregnant the second time they were together, David did what he called the right thing and proposed. The wedding was small, held in the backyard of Mom's house with folding chairs borrowed from the church and a cake Carol's sister made from a box mix. I paid for the flowers and Carol's dress and the deposit on their honeymoon cabin, because that's what family did. David had been taking care of me for years, and now it was my turn to help him start his new life. The first request for money came 2 months after they got back from their honeymoon. Carol had complications with her pregnancy and needed to go on bed rest, which meant she couldn't work her job at the dental office. David's salary at the auto parts store wasn't enough to cover their expenses, especially with medical bills piling up. Just until the baby comes, David promised when I wrote the check. Once Carol's back to work, we'll pay you back with interest. Michael was born healthy and beautiful, and I fell in love with my nephew the moment I held him. He had David's dark hair and Carol's green eyes, and when he wrapped his tiny fingers around mine, I felt something I'd never experienced before. Unconditional love, the kind that didn't come with expectations or conditions or carefully maintained ledgers of who owed what to whom. But Carol didn't go back to work after Michael was born. She developed what David described as severe postpartum depression, though she seemed capable of shopping trips and lunch dates with her friends. And somehow, 6 months of temporary help turned into a year, then 2 years, then a permanent arrangement where I supplemented David and Carol's income because that's what family did. The pattern was so gradual, so incremental, that I didn't notice how completely it had taken over my life until Pat moved back to town after her divorce. Patricia had been David's friend before she became his sister-in-law, one of those tough girls who could outdrink most guys and wasn't afraid to speak her mind. She'd moved to Cleveland after high school, married a man who turned out to be a cheating alcoholic, and spent 15 years trying to make that relationship work before finally giving up and coming home. Pat rented a cramped apartment above the hardware store downtown and got a job waitressing at Murphy's Diner, starting over at 35 with nothing but her car and her attitude. She was funny and sharp and completely unimpressed by David's victim complex, which made family dinners significantly more interesting. "So let me get this straight," she said one Sunday evening as David explained why he needed money for Michael's preschool tuition. "Rachel pays your mortgage when you're short, Rachel bought your car when the old one died, Rachel covered Carol's hospital bills when Michael was born, and now Rachel gets to pay for Michael's education too? It's not like that," David protested. "Rachel knows we're good for it. This is just temporary help until I get that promotion at work." "What promotion?" Pat asked. "You've been talking about that promotion for 3 years." I sat at my grandmother's dining room table, cutting Michael's chicken into bite-sized pieces while he chattered about his day at preschool, and felt something cold settle in my stomach. Pat was right. David had been talking about that promotion for years, just like he'd been talking about Carol going back to work, just like he'd been talking about paying me back for all the temporary help that had somehow become permanent. "Family helps family," Carol said, her tone suggesting the conversation was over. "Rachel understands that." But as I looked around that table, at the family I'd been supporting financially and emotionally for years, I realized I didn't understand it at all. I understood that I was the one who wrote checks when emergencies arose. I understood that I was the one who babysat Michael when David and Carol wanted date nights. I understood that I was the one who organized holiday meals and bought birthday presents and remembered anniversaries. What I didn't understand was what I was getting in return, besides the privilege of being needed. The conversation with Pat happened 2 weeks later, over coffee at Murphy's Diner during her afternoon break. I hadn't planned to confide in her. Hadn't planned to voice the doubts that had been growing since that uncomfortable dinner conversation. But something about Pat's directness, her complete lack of sympathy for self-created problems, made it easy to be honest. "He's using you," she said after I'd finished explaining the latest crisis that had required my financial intervention. "David's been using you since you were 12 years old, and you've let him because you're afraid of being alone." The words hit like a physical blow, partly because they were true and partly because I'd never heard anyone say them out loud. I sat in that vinyl booth, stirring sugar into coffee I didn't want, and felt something crack open inside my chest. "He took care of me after Mom died," I said weakly. "He kept our family together." "No, honey. He kept himself comfortable while making you feel grateful for the privilege." Pat leaned forward, her expression gentler than her words. "David was never your guardian. He was another kid who lost his mom, same as you. But somehow he convinced everyone, including you, that taking care of you was his responsibility and his burden. The money he managed, the money he spent. On himself, on keeping that house, on playing house with Carol. When was the last time David actually sacrificed anything for you, Rachel? When was the last time he did something that cost him? Something he wanted?" I opened my mouth to answer and realized I couldn't. Every example that came to mind was something David claimed to have done for me, not something I'd actually asked for or needed. Staying home for college when he'd never applied anywhere else. Managing mom's life insurance when no one had asked him to. Taking care of me when what he'd really done was take care of himself while making me feel indebted for the privilege. But we're family, I said, the words sounding hollow even to me. Family doesn't keep a running tab of everything they've done for you, Pat replied. Family doesn't make you feel guilty for succeeding or ashamed for needing help. Family celebrates your victories instead of finding ways to diminish them. I thought about my promotion at Henderson Insurance the year before, how excited I'd been to share the news with David and Carol. Instead of congratulations, I'd gotten a lecture about how success changed people, how I shouldn't forget where I came from, how money couldn't buy the things that really mattered. By the end of that conversation, I'd felt guilty for being happy about my own accomplishments. What am I supposed to do? I asked Pat. Cut them off completely? Pretend Michael doesn't exist? You're supposed to stop setting yourself on fire to keep them warm, she said. You're supposed to realize that you deserve better than being someone's backup plan. That conversation planted a seed that grew slowly over the following months. I started paying attention to the patterns Pat had pointed out, noticing how every family gathering somehow ended with me writing a check or agreeing to some favor that benefited David and Carol. I started keeping track of the money I'd given them over the years, adding up numbers that made my stomach turn. $47,000. That's what I'd given my brother and his family in temporary help over 8 years. Enough to buy a car, make a down payment on a house, take a dream vacation to Europe. Enough to change my own life in meaningful ways, if I'd been brave enough to invest in myself instead of subsidizing theirs. But change is hard, especially when it means admitting you've been wrong about something fundamental for most of your adult life. It's easier to keep writing checks than to face the fact that the people you love might not love you back the same way. It's easier to be needed than to risk being rejected. So I kept paying, kept helping, kept playing my assigned role in David's version of family. I told myself that things would change when Michael got older, when Carol went back to work, when David finally got that promotion he'd been chasing for years. I told myself that family was worth the sacrifice, that love required. This kind of selflessness. I told myself a lot of things that weren't true, because the truth was too painful to face. The truth was that I'd spent my entire adult life buying affection from people who saw me as a resource rather than a person. The truth was that I was terrified of what would happen if I stopped being useful to them. The truth was that I'd rather be used than be alone. It took major spinal surgery and the sound of my family arguing over my bedroom to finally understand what Pat had been trying to tell me. Some help comes with strings attached, and some family bonds are really just carefully disguised transactions. And sometimes the people who claim to love you are just waiting for the right opportunity to show you what that love is really worth. As I lay in that hospital bed, listening to David and Carol plan their temporary takeover of my life, I realized that my usefulness had finally outgrown my independence. They didn't just want my money anymore. They wanted my house, my space, my life, neatly packaged as concern for my recovery. And for the first time in 31 years, I was too weak to stop them. The realization should have been devastating. Instead, it was almost liberating. Because once you see the pattern clearly, once you understand exactly what you're dealing with, you can start making different choices. I just had to get strong enough to make them. The first week at home was a masterclass in incremental invasion. Carol moved through my house like a general surveying conquered territory, making small adjustments that individually seemed reasonable but collectively transformed my space into something unrecognizable. She rearranged my kitchen cabinets for better accessibility, which meant everything I used regularly was now stored wherever made sense to her. She reorganized my bathroom vanity to accommodate her extensive collection of skincare products, relegating my simple routine to a corner basket that looked apologetic. Just trying to make everything more efficient, she explained whenever I mentioned the changes. We want your recovery to be as smooth as possible. But efficiency, I was learning, was code for convenience. Carol's convenience, specifically. The kitchen reorganization put her favorite coffee mugs at eye level while mine were relegated to a high shelf I couldn't reach. The bathroom reorganization gave her the prime real estate of the double vanity while my toothbrush and medications were squeezed into the smaller drawers. My bedroom transformation was the most unsettling. Carol had convinced David that I needed a healing environment, which apparently meant stripping away anything that felt personal or comforting. My grandmother's quilt was replaced with a sterile white comforter that would show stains easily. My bedside tables were cleared of books and personal items, replaced with medical supplies and monitoring equipment I didn't need. Even my framed photographs were relocated to make room for what Carol called recovery essentials. You can put everything back once you're better, she assured me, boxing up my belongings with the efficiency of someone packing a storage unit. Right now, we need to focus on function over form. But function seemed to involve an awful lot of David and Carol's belongings finding permanent homes in my space. Carol's jewelry box appeared on my dresser. David's work clothes hung in my closet. Their morning routine took over my bathroom completely, leaving me waiting for access to my own shower like a guest in a hotel with overbooked rooms. The kids adapted to their temporary new home with the enthusiasm of colonizers discovering fertile land. Michael, now 15 and testing every boundary he could find, declared my home office his new gaming room and proceeded to rearrange the furniture to accommodate his elaborate computer setup. When I suggested he might want to set up in the guest room instead, Carol intervened with a lecture about how important it was for teenagers to have their own space. He's been through so much upheaval with our housing situation, she said, as if their decision to move into my house was a natural disaster rather than a choice. The least we can do is make sure he feels comfortable here. 8-year-old Emma was less territorial but more destructive, approaching my house like an endless playground filled with fascinating breakable objects. Within 3 days, she'd chipped my grandmother's teacup, broken the antique music box on my mantel, and somehow managed to get crayon marks on wallpaper that had been pristine for 15 years. When I mentioned the damage to David, he just shrugged. "Kids will be kids," he said. "Besides, this old place could use some updating anyway. Maybe this is a sign that it's time for some renovations." Renovations. Like my recovery was the perfect opportunity to redecorate my home according to someone else's vision. I bit my tongue and said nothing, but I started paying closer attention to the way David and Carol talked about my house. Not your house or Rachel's house, but this place, the house, as if it had somehow become community property during my week in the hospital. Physical therapy was my only escape from the increasingly suffocating atmosphere at home. 3 times a week, I made the 20-minute drive to Riverside Rehabilitation Center, where I worked with a therapist named Marcus who treated my spine like an engineering problem that could be solved with the right combination of exercises and determination. Marcus was a former college athlete who'd blown out his knee and discovered a passion for helping other people rebuild their bodies after injury. "Pain is information," he told me during our first session as I grimaced through a simple stretching routine. "Your job is to listen to what it's telling you and decide whether it's warning you about danger or just complaining about change." I found myself looking forward to those sessions with an intensity that probably wasn't healthy. For 3 hours a week, I was just Rachel, not David's sister or Carol's patient or the source of everyone else's temporary housing solution. I was someone working toward a goal, making measurable progress, reclaiming control over at least one aspect of my life. It was during my 3rd week of therapy that I met Margaret Rodriguez, though everyone called her Maggie. She was a nurse at the rehab center, probably in her 50s, with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and eyes that seemed to see more than most people were comfortable revealing. She had a way of asking simple questions that somehow got to the heart of complicated problems. "How's the home situation working out?" she asked one afternoon as I was changing out of my workout clothes. It was the kind of casual question medical professionals asked routinely, but something in her tone suggested she already suspected the answer. "Fine," I said automatically, then caught myself. "Actually, it's more complicated than I expected." Maggie nodded like she'd heard this story before. Family dynamics have a way of getting complicated when someone becomes dependent. Sometimes the people who offer help have their own ideas about what help should look like. There was something about her directness that reminded me of Pat, the same unwillingness to accept polite lies or convenient fiction. Before I could stop myself, I was telling her about Carol's reorganization projects and David's casual appropriation of my space and the way I felt like a guest in my own home. "How long are they planning to stay?" Maggie asked. "Until I'm fully recovered. Maybe 8 weeks total." "And after that?" The question caught me off guard because I'd been so focused on surviving the recovery period that I hadn't thought much about what came next. "I guess they'll move back to their place." Maggie's expression was carefully neutral, but something in her eyes suggested she had doubts about that timeline. "Have they said anything about their own housing situation? Any reason they might want to extend the timeline?" I thought about the way Carol had been talking about renovations, the way she'd mentioned that their lease was up for renewal soon, the way David had been hinting that Michael needed stability during his freshman year of high school. None of it had seemed concerning at the time, but now, viewed through Maggie's skeptical lens, it formed a pattern that made my stomach clench. "They haven't said anything specific," I said slowly. "But there have been hints." "There usually are." Maggie handed me my jacket and fixed me with a steady look. "Rachel, can I give you some advice from someone who's seen a lot of family recoveries go sideways?" I nodded, not trusting my voice. "Set boundaries now, while you still can. People who move into your space during a crisis have a way of finding reasons why moving out would be disruptive or harmful or just plain inconvenient. The longer they stay, the more established they become, and the harder it gets to reclaim your own life. But I need help, I protested. I can't manage on my own yet. There's a difference between accepting help and surrendering control, Maggie said gently. Help means they assist you with tasks you can't do yourself. Surrendering control means they take over your life and call it help. That conversation echoed in my head during the drive home, competing with the voice that had been trained to feel guilty for questioning family loyalty. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I'd almost convinced myself that Maggie was being overly cautious, that David and Carol were genuinely trying to help, that my discomfort was just an adjustment. Period. Then I walked into my house and found Carol on the phone with a real estate agent. Just want to get a sense of the market value, she was saying, standing in my living room with a notepad in her hand. It's a 1950s colonial, about 2,400 square feet, original hardwood floors, updated kitchen. Corner lot with mature landscaping. She saw me standing in the doorway and quickly wrapped up the call, but not before I heard her give my address to whoever was on the other end. When she hung up, her smile was bright and explanatory, the expression of someone who'd been caught doing something innocent that just looked suspicious. I was just curious about property values in the neighborhood, she said, tucking the notepad into her purse. David and I have been thinking about buying instead of renting, and I wanted to see what houses like this one are going for. Houses like this one. Not this house specifically, but houses like it. The distinction felt important, though I couldn't articulate why. Are you thinking about moving to this neighborhood? I asked, settling carefully onto the couch and trying to keep my voice casual. Oh, we couldn't afford anything around here on David's salary, Carol laughed. I was just curious. You know how it is, you start thinking about equity and investment potential, and suddenly you're researching real estate prices. But there was something in her tone that didn't match her words, something calculating that made me think of David at 15, explaining why he needed to manage Mom's life insurance money. I spent the rest of the evening trying to shake the feeling that I'd walked in on something significant, some conversation or plan that Carol had cut short when she saw me. That night, I called Pat from my bedroom while David and Carol were downstairs watching television. I hadn't planned to call her, hadn't planned to voice the suspicions that were growing like weeds in my mind, but hearing Carol discuss my house like it was a commodity had shaken something loose inside me. She was getting it appraised? Pat's voice was sharp with alarm. Rachel, please tell me you're not thinking of selling. No, of course not. She said she was just curious about the market. And you believed her? The question hung in the air between us, loaded with implications I didn't want to examine. I don't know what to believe anymore. Everything feels wrong, but I can't tell if that's because they're actually doing something wrong or because I'm not used to sharing my space. Trust your instincts, Pat said firmly. Your instincts have been trying to warn you about David for years, but you keep talking yourself out of listening to them. After I hung up, I lay in my own bed in my own room and tried to figure out why everything felt so foreign. Carol had rearranged the furniture just enough to make the space feel different, less mine and more neutral. My personal belongings had been temporarily relocated to make room for medical equipment I didn't use and convenience items that seemed to benefit everyone except me. Even the air felt different, filled with the scent of Carol's perfume and the sound of unfamiliar footsteps on my floors. But it was more than just physical changes. There was an energy in the house that hadn't been there before, a sense of ownership that went beyond temporary caregiving. David and Carol moved through my space with increasing familiarity, making decisions about everything from what to have for dinner to which television programs to watch. They'd stopped asking my opinion about household matters, stopped treating me like the homeowner and started treating me like someone they were graciously accommodating. The shift had been so gradual that I couldn't pinpoint exactly when it happened, but at some point during my recovery, I'd stopped being the person they were helping and started being the person in the way. The breaking point came during my 4th week at home, on a Tuesday morning that started like any other but ended with me understanding exactly what kind of help my family had really been providing. I'd gotten up early for my physical therapy appointment, moving carefully through my morning routine and trying not to disturb anyone else in the house. David and Carol were both still asleep, and the kids wouldn't be up for another hour, so I had a rare moment of quiet in my own space. I made coffee in my reorganized kitchen, retrieved my keys from the bowl by the front door where I'd always kept them, and headed out to my car. Except my car wasn't in the driveway. I stood on my front porch in my workout clothes, car keys in hand, staring at the empty space where my sedan should have been. For a moment, I wondered if I was confused, if the medication was affecting my memory, if I'd somehow forgotten lending my car to someone. But no, I distinctly remembered parking it in its usual spot after yesterday's therapy session. Back inside, I found David in the kitchen, already dressed for work and pouring coffee into a travel mug I didn't recognize. Where's my car? I asked, trying to keep my voice level. David looked up with the expression of someone who'd forgotten to mention something minor. Oh, right. Carol needed to take Emma to that doctor's appointment this morning, and her car's in the shop. I told her she could borrow yours since you're not driving much anyway. I have physical therapy this morning. I can drop you off on my way to work, David said, checking his watch. We should probably leave in about 10 minutes. The casual way he'd rearranged my morning, the assumption that my schedule was flexible while everyone else's was set in stone, the complete absence of any consultation about using my car, all of it crystallized into a moment of clarity that was both painful and liberating. You gave Carol my car without asking me, I said. I told her she could use it. It's not like you're driving to work every day right now. It's my car. David's expression shifted from casual dismissal to irritation. Rachel, we're all making sacrifices here. Carol's been taking care of you for weeks, doing your shopping, cooking your meals, managing your medications. The least you can do is share resources when she needs help. Share resources. Like my car was community property, like my house was a group investment, like my recovery was a team effort that required everyone to contribute equally regardless of who actually owned what. I need my car back, I said. She'll have it back this afternoon. Emma's appointment is at 9, then she's got errands to run. You can survive one day without driving. But it wasn't about surviving one day without driving. It was about the principle of being consulted about decisions that affected my life, about maintaining some basic autonomy even while accepting help. It was about the difference between being supported and being managed. Call her, I said. Tell her to come back and get you, and I'll drive myself to therapy. David's jaw tightened. You're being ridiculous. This is exactly the kind of selfishness that, selfishness? The word came out louder than I'd intended, sharp enough to cut through David's lecture. Wanting access to my own car is selfish? Wanting to inconvenience everyone else when there's a perfectly reasonable solution is selfish, yes. The argument escalated from there, voices rising as weeks of accumulated resentment spilled out. David accused me of being ungrateful for everything they'd done, of treating them like servants instead of family, of making recovery harder by being inflexible about minor inconveniences. I accused him of taking over my life, of making decisions without consulting me, of treating my house like his personal property. Carol emerged from upstairs in the middle of our fight, already dressed and holding Emma's hand, clearly expecting to walk out to my car and drive away without any discussion. When she realized what was happening, her expression went from confusion to hurt to righteous indignation in rapid succession. I cannot believe you're making a scene about this, she said, her voice heavy with disappointment. After everything we've done for you, after how hard we've been working to help you recover, you're going to create drama over letting me borrow your car for a few hours? It's not about the car, I said, though I was starting to realize that. It was about the car, in the same way that civil rights movements were about bus seats and water fountains. It was about the symbol, the principle, the line in the sand that marked the difference between help and takeover. Then what is it about? Carol demanded. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're punishing us for caring about you. And there it was, the emotional manipulation that had been lurking underneath all the helpful reorganization and caring management. The suggestion that my discomfort with their increasing control was actually ingratitude for their sacrifice. The implication that setting boundaries was the same as rejecting love. It was the same technique David had perfected as a teenager, the same guilt-based argument that had kept me writing checks and accepting explanations and doubting my own perceptions for decades. But something about hearing it applied to my car, my house, my basic autonomy made it impossible to accept. Get out, I said quietly. The words seemed to surprise all of us, including me. They hung in the air of my kitchen like a challenge none of us had expected. What? David's voice was carefully controlled, the tone of someone talking to an unstable person. Get out of my house. All of you. Now. The silence that followed was deafening. Emma pressed closer to Carol's side, clearly sensing the tension even if she didn't understand it. Carol's face cycled through several expressions before settling on martyred hurt. David just stared at me like I'd started speaking a foreign language. Rachel, Carol said finally, her voice gentle in the way people used with mental patience. You're not thinking clearly. You just had major surgery. You can't take care of yourself yet. I'll figure it out. This is ridiculous, David snapped. You can't throw us out because of one small disagreement about a car. This isn't about the car, and you know it. This is about the fact that you've been treating my house like yours, my belongings like yours, my life like something you get to manage and control. We've been helping you. You've been helping yourselves. To my space, my resources, my autonomy. And I'm done with it. The argument that followed was loud enough to wake Michael, who appeared at the top of the stairs in his pajamas looking confused and angry about being dragged into adult drama. It involved accusations and counter-accusations, threats and ultimatums. And finally David's declaration that if I was going to be ungrateful and unreasonable, fine, they'd leave, but they wouldn't be coming back. "Don't expect us to drop everything and come running the next time you need help," he said as Carol gathered their belongings with the efficiency of someone who'd been planning this exit strategy. "Family works both ways, Rachel, and you just chose your side." They were packed and gone within 2 hours, leaving behind only a few forgotten items and the lingering scent of Carol's perfume. The house felt enormous and empty and completely mine for the first time in a month. I sat on my couch in the sudden silence, surrounded by my belongings in their wrong places and my furniture in its rearranged positions, and wondered if I'd just made the biggest mistake of my life. I was 5 weeks post-surgery, still wearing a back brace, still limited in what I could lift and carry and do. I had no help with meals or household tasks, no one to drive me to appointments, no family support system to catch me if I fell. But I also had my car keys back in my hand, my coffee mug back in its rightful cabinet, and my bedroom back to being my bedroom instead of someone else's temporary headquarters. For the first time in weeks, I could breathe. The first 3 days alone were terrifying in ways I hadn't anticipated. Not because I couldn't manage the basic tasks of living, I'd been doing most of those things for myself even with David and Carol in the house, but because the silence felt so complete. For weeks, my home had been filled with voices and footsteps, and the constant background hum of other people's lives. Now it echoed with my own breathing and the creak of settling floorboards. I discovered muscles I'd forgotten I had as I slowly reclaimed my space. Moving Carol's skincare products out of my bathroom and back to the guest room. Returning my kitchen to its original organization, even if it meant struggling with step stools to reach higher shelves. Carrying David's forgotten work shirts to the laundry room, trying not to think about how familiar they'd become hanging in my closet. Every task took twice as long as it should have, but there was something deeply satisfying about making decisions without consultation, about eating dinner at whatever time felt right instead of accommodating everyone else's schedule. I played music David had always complained was too quiet and ate cereal for dinner without anyone commenting on my nutritional choices. But the isolation was real, and it scared me more than I wanted to admit. My phone stayed silent except for appointment reminders and automated messages from my insurance company. Pat texted once to check in, but she was working double shifts at the diner and dealing with her own crisis. Her landlord had decided to sell the building, which meant she needed to find a new apartment she couldn't afford. It was Maggie who called on Thursday evening, ostensibly to confirm my Friday appointment but really to check on how I was managing alone. "How's the independence treating you?" she asked, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "It's quieter than I expected," I admitted, curled up on my couch with a heating pad pressed against my lower back. "And harder. I keep reaching for things I can't lift and forgetting I'm not supposed to bend at the waist." "That's normal. Your body remembers old patterns even when your brain knows better. Are you eating okay? Getting enough rest?" I looked around my living room, which still bore traces of Carol's reorganization but was slowly returning to its familiar configuration. "I'm managing. It's just strange being here alone after weeks of having people around constantly." "Alone can be good," Maggie said gently. "Gives you space to think without other people's opinions clouding your judgment." "Have you heard from your family since they left?" "No. And I don't expect to." David made it pretty clear that I burned bridges when I asked them to leave. There was a pause on Maggie's end, long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. When she spoke again, her voice was carefully neutral. "Rachel, can I ask you something that might sound strange?" "Sure. Have you checked your mail lately? Like, really checked it, gone through everything instead of just grabbing bills and magazines?" The question caught me off guard. "I haven't been getting much mail. David was bringing it in while they were here, but since they left, it's just been the usual stuff." "Might be worth taking a closer look," Maggie said. "Sometimes when family members are helping during recovery, important things can get overlooked or misfiled." After I hung up, Maggie's suggestion nagged at me. David had been bringing in the mail every day, usually setting it on the kitchen counter in a neat pile. I'd assumed he was just grabbing bills and junk mail, nothing that required my immediate attention while I was focusing on recovery. But now I wondered what I might have missed. The next morning, I checked my mailbox for the first time in weeks. Along with the usual collection of advertisements and utility bills was a thick envelope from Mitchell & Associates, the law firm that had handled my grandmother's estate years ago. The return address made my stomach tighten. I hadn't heard from James Mitchell since settling my grandmother's will, and lawyers didn't typically send unsolicited mail. Inside was a letter dated 3 weeks earlier, along with several legal documents I didn't immediately understand. The letter was formal, but concerned, explaining that Mr. Mitchell had been trying to reach me about an urgent matter regarding my family's estate planning. There had been inquiries about my property, questions about my capacity to make legal decisions, and someone had been asking about procedures for emergency conservatorship. Emergency conservatorship. The words made my blood run cold. According to the letter, someone had contacted Mitchell's office claiming that I was incapacitated following surgery and might need legal protection for my financial interests. The caller had identified themselves as my primary caregiver and had asked detailed questions about how to initiate proceedings to manage my affairs if I became unable to do so myself. The caller's name was listed in the notes, Carol Thompson. I read the letter 3 times before the full implications sank in. While I'd been focused on recovering from surgery, trusting my family to help me navigate the most vulnerable period of my adult life, Carol had been researching how to take legal control of my assets. The phone call about property values suddenly made perfect sense. She hadn't been curious about the market. She'd been establishing the value of what she was planning to claim. The legal documents included information about conservatorship proceedings, power of attorney transfers, and something called emergency guardianship that could be initiated if a person was deemed temporarily incapacitated. According to the materials, family members could petition the court for authority to manage an incapacitated person's finances and property, especially in cases where the person was unable to make sound decisions due to medical conditions or medication effects. My hands shook as I reached for my phone to call Mitchell's office. The receptionist put me through immediately when I gave my name, and James Mitchell's familiar voice carried 20 years of professional caution. "Rachel, I'm glad you're calling. I've been trying to reach you for weeks. How are you feeling?" "Confused," I said honestly. "And angry. Can you explain what Carol was asking about?" There was a pause before Mitchell spoke, the careful silence of a lawyer choosing his words precisely. "Mrs. Thompson called my office approximately 4 weeks ago, claiming to be your caregiver following major surgery. She expressed concern about your ability to manage your affairs during recovery and asked about legal mechanisms for protecting your interests." "What kind of legal mechanisms?" "Primarily conservatorship proceedings. She wanted to know how a family member could gain legal authority to make financial and property decisions on behalf of someone who was temporarily incapacitated." The room seemed to tilt around me. 4 weeks ago, I'd still been in the hospital, barely conscious from pain medication and completely dependent on my family for basic care. While I'd been grateful for their support, Carol had been planning how to legally seize control of my life. "Did she file any paperwork?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "No, nothing was filed. But she did ask very specific questions about your property, your financial situation, and whether you had updated estate documents. She also inquired about the timeline for conservatorship proceedings and whether temporary emergency orders could be obtained quickly." "Emergency orders for what?" "To prevent someone from making harmful financial decisions while incapacitated. For example, if someone was concerned that you might be pressured into selling your house or transferring property while under the influence of pain medication." The irony was breathtaking. Carol had been researching legal ways to prevent me from making harmful financial decisions while simultaneously planning to make those exact decisions on my behalf. She'd been setting up a scenario where my recovery medications could be used as evidence of incapacity, where my dependence on family care could be framed as inability to manage my own affairs. "Mr. Mitchell, if someone had filed for emergency conservatorship while I was in the hospital, what would have happened?" "With medical documentation of major surgery and testimony from family members about your incapacity, a temporary order could potentially be granted within days. It would give the conservator authority to manage your finances and property until a full hearing could be held." "And how long until a full hearing?" "Could be months, depending on the court's schedule. During that time, the temporary conservator would have broad authority to make decisions about your assets." I thanked Mitchell and hung up, my mind racing through the implications. If Carol's plan had worked, I could have woken up from surgery to find that my brother had legal authority over my house, my bank accounts, my entire financial life. They could have moved into my home not as temporary caregivers but as court-appointed managers of my property. They could have sold my house, accessed my savings, made decisions about my care based on what was financially convenient rather than what was medically necessary. The worst part was how plausible it would have seemed. A woman recovering from major spinal surgery, dependent on pain medication, unable to drive or work or manage household tasks, it wouldn't have been difficult to argue that I needed protection from making impulsive decisions during recovery. Especially with David and Carol there to provide testimony about my confusion, my inability to handle basic tasks, my obvious need for comprehensive care management. That afternoon, I called Pat and told her everything. She listened without interruption until I finished describing Carol's call to the lawyer, then exploded with the kind of creative profanity that would have made her ex-husband proud. "That calculating bitch," she said when she'd exhausted her initial vocabulary. "Rachel, do you understand what they were trying to do? They were planning to steal your life." "I know. But I can't prove they were going to follow through." Carol could claim she was just being cautious, trying to protect me. "Protect you from what? Making your own decisions about your own life?" Pat's voice was sharp with anger. "This is exactly what I've been trying to tell you about David for years. He doesn't see you as a person with rights and autonomy. He sees you as a resource to be managed." "What am I supposed to do with this information?" "They're gone now. I kicked them out." "Good. But Rachel, you need to understand that this isn't over. People who research conservatorship proceedings while their family member is in the hospital don't just give up and walk away. They regroup and try a different approach." Pat's words echoed in my head over the weekend as I slowly worked through the accumulated mail David had been filtering. Most of it was routine, bills, advertisements, appointment reminders, but there were several items that should have been brought to my attention immediately. A notice from my homeowner's insurance about policy renewal. A letter from my bank about changes to my mortgage terms. A certified mail slip indicating that something important had been attempted for delivery but no one had been available to sign. David had signed for the certified letter, according to the Postal Service tracking information. But there was no record of what had been delivered or where it might be now. When I called the post office to inquire, they told me the letter had been signed for by someone named D. Thompson on my behalf, but they couldn't provide details about the contents. I spent Sunday afternoon searching my house for any mail I might have missed, checking drawers and closets and anywhere David or Carol might have stored important documents. In the guest room closet, behind some of Carol's forgotten scarves, I found a manila folder filled with papers I'd never seen before. The folder contained photocopies of my financial statements, my insurance policies, my mortgage documents, and my grandmother's will. Someone had gone through my personal files and copied everything related to my assets and property ownership. There were also printed pages from real estate websites showing recent sales in my neighborhood, market analysis reports, and what appeared to be a preliminary assessment of my house's current value. At the bottom of the folder was a handwritten note in Carol's neat script: property tax assessment $847,000. Mortgage balance $89,000. Equity position $758,000. Comparable sales suggest market value $920,000 to $980,000. They hadn't just been researching conservatorship proceedings. They'd been conducting a complete financial audit of my life, calculating exactly what they could gain control over if their legal maneuver succeeded. The numbers were written with the precision of someone planning a business transaction, not someone concerned about family members' well-being. That night, I sat in my living room with the folder spread across my coffee table and tried to piece together the full scope of what David and Carol had been planning. The timeline was chilling in its efficiency. They'd moved into my house under the guise of providing care, immediately begun researching legal mechanisms for gaining control of my assets, and systematically documented my financial situation while I was too medicated and vulnerable to notice. If I hadn't overheard Carol on the phone with the real estate agent, if I hadn't demanded my car keys back, if I hadn't finally found the courage to tell them to leave, they could have filed for emergency conservatorship and been legally authorized to manage my property within days. My house, my savings, my entire life's work could have been under their control while I spent months fighting to prove I was competent to manage my own affairs. The realization left me feeling sick and grateful. In equal measure. Sick that my own family had been planning to exploit my medical crisis for financial gain. Grateful that my instincts had finally overridden my conditioning to trust them. Monday morning brought another surprise. I was checking my email when I found a message from my homeowner's insurance company about a claim that had been filed on my policy. According to the notification, someone had reported damage to my property during the time I was in the hospital and had requested immediate processing for emergency repairs. The claim was for $47,000 in water damage to the basement and foundation, supposedly discovered while I was recovering upstairs. The claim had been filed by David Thompson, identifying himself as my authorized representative, and included a contractor's estimate for extensive renovation work. I hung up on my insurance agent and called a plumber immediately. Within 2 hours, I had confirmation that there was no water damage in my basement, no foundation problems, and no evidence of any recent repairs or emergency work. My basement was dry, solid, and completely normal. David had filed a fraudulent insurance claim on my property while I was recovering from surgery. He'd essentially tried to steal $47,000 from my insurance company using my policy, probably planning to pocket the money while claiming it was necessary for repairs that would benefit me. The amount wasn't random. $47,000 was exactly what I'd calculated giving them in temporary help over the years. David had decided it was time to collect that debt, with interest, using my insurance policy as his personal reimbursement fund. When I called Mitchell's office to report the insurance fraud, he listened with the weary patience of someone who'd seen too many family financial disputes turn ugly. "Rachel, I think you need to consider the possibility that this is bigger than opportunistic theft," he said carefully. "The conservatorship inquiry, the financial documentation, the insurance claim, this looks like a coordinated plan to gain access to your assets through multiple channels. You think they're still planning something? I think you should protect yourself legally. Update your will, establish clear directives about who has authority to make decisions if you're ever incapacitated, maybe consider a trust to protect your property from future claims." That afternoon, I made an appointment to update my estate planning documents. For the first time in my adult life, I was going to make decisions about my money and property without considering how they might affect David and Carol's financial situation. I was going to protect myself from the family that had spent decades treating me like their personal bank account. The appointment was scheduled for the following week, but I didn't want to wait that long to take some immediate action. I called my bank and placed fraud alerts on all my accounts. I contacted my mortgage company to verify that no one had tried to access information about refinancing or equity loans. I even called my employer to make sure no one had contacted them about my disability status or financial situation. Every call revealed new attempts by David or Carol to access information about my finances. They'd been busy during my recovery, making inquiries and gathering data for whatever their ultimate plan had been. If I'd remained naive about their intentions, if I'd continued to trust their help without question, they could have assembled everything they needed to take control of my life. But I'd caught them just in time. They were gone, their plans were exposed, and I was finally awake to who they really were and what they'd been doing to me for decades. The only question now was what I was going to do with that knowledge. The meeting with James Mitchell the following Tuesday was supposed to be routine estate planning, but it turned into something much more strategic. I sat in his oak-paneled office, surrounded by law books and diplomas, and laid out everything I'd discovered about David and Carol's plans. Mitchell listened with the practiced attention of someone who'd spent decades untangling family financial disputes. "Given what you've told me, I think we need to go beyond simple will updates," he said, steepling his fingers as he considered the options. "Your family has demonstrated a pattern of financial manipulation and attempted fraud. We need to create protections that account for future attempts to exploit your assets." Over the next 2 hours, we crafted a comprehensive plan that would ensure my family's greed would be their downfall. The centerpiece was a new will that included specific language about financial elder abuse and attempted fraud. Anyone who had tried to gain unauthorized access to my assets, filed false insurance claims, or attempted to obtain conservatorship without proper cause would be automatically excluded from inheritance. But the real masterstroke was Mitchell's suggestion for a charitable remainder trust. The trust would allow me to continue living in my house and managing my assets during my lifetime, but upon my death, the bulk of my estate would go to organizations that supported financial abuse victims and elder advocacy groups. David and Carol would inherit exactly what they'd tried to steal through fraud, nothing. "There's one more element we should consider," Mitchell said as we finalized the documents. "A letter of explanation to be read with the will. Something that makes clear why these decisions were made, so there's no confusion about your mental capacity or motivations." I spent the rest of that week writing the letter. It was harder than I'd expected, putting into words the decades of manipulation, the pattern of exploitation, and the final betrayal that had opened my eyes to who my family really was. But it was also liberating, like finally speaking a truth I'd been avoiding my entire adult life. The letter detailed every financial manipulation from David's management of Mom's life insurance to Carol's conservatorship research. I included copies of the fraudulent insurance claim, the real estate inquiries, and the folder of financial documents they'd copied without permission. I wanted anyone reading the will to understand that this wasn't spite or senility, it was justice. My recovery accelerated once I'd taken control of my legal situation. Physical therapy became easier when I wasn't stressed about family dynamics. Sleep came more naturally in a house that felt truly mine again. Even simple tasks like cooking dinner felt different when I wasn't wondering what David and Carol were planning behind my back. Pat was my only visitor during those weeks, stopping by after her shifts at the diner to check on my progress and share updates about her apartment search. She was the one person who understood why cutting ties with David and Carol was necessary rather than tragic. "You look different," she said one evening as we sat on my front porch watching the sunset. "Lighter, somehow. I feel different. Like I've been holding my breath for 30 years and finally remembered how to exhale." "Any regrets about kicking them out?" I considered the question seriously. There were moments when the silence felt overwhelming, when I missed having people around even if those people had been exploiting me. But regret? No. The only thing I regret is how long it took me to see what was really happening. 3 months after David and Carol left, I was strong enough to return to work part-time. My colleagues at Henderson Insurance welcomed me back with genuine warmth, asking about my recovery and offering flexible scheduling to accommodate my ongoing physical therapy. It felt good to be productive again, to use my mind for something other than analyzing family dysfunction. That's when David called. I was at my desk, reviewing actuarial tables and feeling almost normal, when my phone rang with his number. I hadn't heard from him since the morning they'd stormed out of my house, and seeing his name on my screen brought back all the anxiety I'd finally learned to manage. "Rachel, we need to talk." His voice was carefully controlled, the tone he used when he was trying to seem reasonable while making unreasonable demands. "I don't think we do. This family feud has gone on long enough. Carol and I have been giving you space to cool down, but it's time to be adults about this situation." The phrase, "be adults," coming from someone who'd tried to commit insurance fraud while I was recovering from surgery was almost laughable. "What do you want, David?" "We want to work things out. Look, maybe we made some mistakes while you were recovering. Maybe we overstepped boundaries. But we're family, and family forgives each other." "What kind of mistakes are you referring to? The part where Carol researched taking legal control of my assets, or the part where you filed a fraudulent insurance claim on my house?" The silence on his end was telling. He'd assumed I didn't know about those activities, probably figured I'd been too medicated and dependent to notice what they were really doing. "I don't know what you think you discovered," he said finally, "but you're misinterpreting things. We were trying to protect you." "From what?" "From making bad decisions while you were on pain medication. From people who might try to take advantage of your situation." The irony was so complete it was almost beautiful. "People like you? Rachel, this is exactly the kind of paranoid thinking that worried us. You're seeing conspiracies where there were just family members trying to help." But I wasn't the same person who'd accepted his explanations without question for decades. I'd learned to trust my own perceptions, to value my own judgment over his version of reality. "David, here's what's going to happen. You're going to stay away from me, away from my house, and away from my finances. Any attempt to contact me again will be considered harassment. You can't just cut off your family because of a misunderstanding. Watch me." I hung up and immediately called Mitchell's office to report the contact. He advised me to document any future attempts at communication and consider a restraining order if David persisted. But David was smart enough to understand when he'd lost. The call wasn't repeated. What I didn't expect was the campaign of whispered character assassination that followed. Slowly, I began hearing from mutual acquaintances about how worried David and Carol were about my mental health. How the surgery had changed me, made me paranoid and suspicious of family who'd only tried to help. How they'd sacrificed months of their lives to care for me, only to be thrown out over minor disagreements about household management. The narrative they constructed was compelling because it contained elements of truth. I had changed after the surgery. I'd become less trusting, less willing to accept explanations that didn't match my observations. I had thrown them out over what could be characterized as household disagreements, if you ignored the fraud and attempted legal manipulation behind those disagreements. Some people bought their version of events. At the grocery store, at church, at community events, I noticed the careful way certain people interacted with me. The extra politeness that suggested they'd heard I was fragile or difficult. The gentle questions about how I was really doing that implied they'd been told I wasn't doing well at all. But I'd learned something important during my recovery. Other people's opinions of my choices mattered far less than the peace I felt when those choices were my own. Let David and Carol spin whatever story made them feel better about their failed exploitation. I knew the truth, and that was enough. The months that followed were the most peaceful of my adult life. I finished my physical therapy and regained full mobility. I returned to work full-time and found new satisfaction in projects that had felt routine before. I traveled to places I'd always wanted to visit but had never found time for when I was constantly solving other people's crises. Most importantly, I learned to enjoy my own company. For the first time since childhood, I wasn't responsible for anyone else's financial or emotional well-being. I wasn't the family bank, the reliable sister, the person everyone called when they needed something. I was just Rachel, living in her own house, making her own decisions, answerable only to herself. The final piece of poetic justice came 18 months later, on a Tuesday morning that started like any other. I was reading the newspaper with my coffee when I saw the notice in the legal section. David and Carol were filing for bankruptcy. According to the public records, they'd accumulated significant debt during the time they'd been planning to exploit my assets. Credit cards, personal loans, even a second mortgage on their house, all apparently taken on the assumption that they'd soon have access to my property and savings to cover their obligations. When their plan to gain control of my assets failed, they'd been left with debt they couldn't service and no way to pay it back. Their house was in foreclosure. Their cars had been repossessed. They were being sued by multiple creditors for defaulted loans. They'd gambled their financial future on stealing mine, and they'd lost everything. I should have felt vindicated, but mostly I felt sad. Sad that they'd chosen greed over family relationships. Sad that they'd destroyed their own lives pursuing something that had never belonged to them. Sad that Michael and Emma would pay the price for their parents' choices. But I didn't feel guilty, and that was progress. Their financial problems were the direct result of their decisions to commit fraud and attempt theft. I hadn't caused their downfall, I'd simply prevented them from dragging me down with them. That afternoon, I called Mitchell to make a final addition to my will. I wanted to establish a small trust fund for Michael and Emma's education, money that couldn't be accessed by their parents but would be available for college tuition when they came of age. David and Carol had forfeited any claim to my assets, but their children shouldn't suffer for their parents' greed. The trust was modest, enough for state university tuition and basic expenses, but not enough to solve David and Carol's financial problems even if they could access it, which they couldn't. It was my way of maintaining family connections without enabling the people who'd tried to exploit me. Years later, when Michael graduated high school and learned about the education trust, he called to thank me. He was mature enough by then to understand that his parents' relationship with me had been complicated, and wise enough not to ask for details about what had gone wrong. "I don't know what happened between you and my parents," he said during that conversation. "But I want you to know that I'm grateful for this opportunity, and I won't waste it." He didn't waste it. Michael went to college, graduated with honors, and became a teacher. Emma followed a few years later, studying social work with a focus on family advocacy. Neither of them grew up to be entitled or manipulative. Somehow, despite their parents' example, they'd learned to value honest work and genuine relationships. David and Carol never recovered financially from their failed scheme. They moved into a small apartment across town, both working retail jobs and struggling to rebuild credit they'd destroyed chasing easy money. We occasionally crossed paths in public. Riverside isn't a large town, but they'd learned to avoid eye contact and keep their distance. I often wondered if they understood the irony of their situation. They'd spent decades positioning themselves as victims of circumstance, people who deserved help because life had been unfair to them. But when they'd finally had the opportunity to secure the comfortable lifestyle they felt entitled to, they'd chosen the path of deception and fraud instead of honest work and patience. Their greed had cost them not just my financial support, but their children's respect, their community standing, and their own self-respect. They'd gained nothing and lost everything, all because they couldn't resist the temptation to steal rather than earn. As for me, I thrived in ways I'd never imagined possible when I was spending my energy managing other people's crises. I got promoted at work, traveled to Europe for the first time, learned to paint watercolors, and discovered that life without drama was far more interesting than life spent constantly putting out other people's fires. The house that David and Carol had tried to claim through legal manipulation became my sanctuary in the truest sense. Every room held memories of my own choosing, every piece of furniture reflected my own taste, every decision about maintenance and decoration was mine alone to make. Sometimes people asked if I missed having family around, if I regretted the way things had ended with David and Carol. The answer was always the same: I missed the family I'd thought I had, but I didn't miss the family I'd actually had. There's a difference between being alone and being lonely, just like there's a difference between being helped and being managed. I learned both differences the hard way, but I learned them completely. And that education, painful as it was, turned out to be the best investment I'd ever made. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.